Okay, so this is our last session of today. Let me again share my screen. So we were discussing agricultural productivity, and we saw that climate conditions, the rainfall, basically, and the type of weather conditions or humidity conditions create certain advantages for certain countries in terms of the diversity and the productivity of agricultural products. Now, the other thing that is important, the second thing, is the disease environment. Very warm climates, especially those we see in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeastern Asia, are of course are more prone to certain diseases. Malaria and other epidemic diseases are more easily become threats to human societies in those regions. So latitude is an important indicator of that, because depending on the latitude of the country, the average temperature and average humidity changes, of course, and certain diseases are more prevalent in certain climates. Why is that important for growth? Well, because first of all, it directly affects mortality. Okay, now through its effects on mortality, it affects fertility, and since it affects fertility, it affects human capital. Okay, now mortality may also have a direct effect of human capital. Why? Because if your lifespan, if your expected lifespan is lower, then you are not really very incentivized to accumulate education, to accumulate human capital through education and other stuff, right? So mortality has a direct effect of human capital on human capital, and an indirect effect through fertility, because fertility and human capital decisions are usually interconnected. Okay. Now the other channel is that, especially in the colonial times, since geography and climate does not change from one century to the other, colonial mortality creates bad institutions, or to be correct, they are called extractive institutions. Now, the main reference for this is Acemoğlu et al. 2001 American Economic Review. That's a very nice paper. I would strongly recommend you to read it. Okay? Yes.
What does colonial mortality means?
Colonial mortality means mortality of the settlers in the colonial times. Suppose that in the 18th century, European colonial empires have colonized many countries, right? Let's take two examples: New Zealand and Congo. Now, what are the main differences between New Zealand and Congo? Well, in terms of colonial mortality, New Zealand is a nice country with low mortality. Congo is particularly troublesome. Okay, so what happened? Settlers in New Zealand created inclusive institutions in New Zealand because they were thinking about settling there. Okay, so they demanded from the Queen the same rights and same types of institutions as they have in England. In Congo, Belgian people basically extracted the resources of Congo, the precious metals and all the other useful or valuable resources. So their purpose is not to settle down in Congo. They realize that Congo is a terrible country in terms of disease environment. So they only created extractive institutions. So they basically robbed the Congo economy, Congo society, and they left with what they have, with all the precious metals and valuable goods, and left there what? Left there the bad institutions. Because usually, as you know from the dependency theorists, right? We studied dependency theories in the earlier semester. We know that when global capitalism enters your country, there is already a set of people, elite people, the compradors. They work together with them, right? So once the bad institutions are established, institutions are very hard to change, right? So in Congo, there is still, so from bad institutions in colonial times, there is another arrow to bad institutions today. Okay, so that's the main idea of this paper, and Acemoğlu and his friends actually show that through econometric investigation. Okay, now the last thing, let me highlight it through green color. The last thing is that climate has a direct effect on productivity. Why? Well, because it is very hard to do manual jobs, especially in agriculture, if the climate is too humid and too hot. Okay. Now you may say that, wait, humans are originally from Africa, right? So we have the genes that must be suitable for working in such conditions. Well, no, that's not the case. Why? Because it is true that our species originated from Africa, but we traveled all around the world, and in the colder climates, we use the power of fire, all right? So it was historically easier to heat ourselves, right? But it was not historically easy to invent air conditioner. So if you have air conditioner, you can still do you can still work productively in office environments, right? But if your economy is somehow more agricultural, if manual jobs are more abundant, so your economy is largely dependent on that type of low-skilled industries, then even in the industrial sector, you realize lower average productivity. So you can compare, for instance, I don't know, Britain with Cote d'Ivoire. Have you ever been to a very humid country in close to equatorial line? So that type of humidity is not that, so you cannot possibly be productive if you are working in an open field, or if you are a manual worker working in an urban area. So that directly affects productivity. And of course, what we realize is that air conditioner is an expensive technology. Still today, it consumes a lot of energy, a lot of electrical energy. So it is not cheap at all. So these are the three mechanisms that directly affect long-run growth through agricultural productivity, because of the diversity and productivity of goods, creating import or export commodity dependencies and all the other things. Disease environments have direct and indirect effects on the long-run growth through fertility, through colonial mortality, etc. And then we have direct effects on productivity of manual workers, because it is difficult to cool down the work environment in terms of technology and energy requirements. Okay, the last part is reserved for natural resources. And as I said before, we are thinking about underground resources and resources on the surface. Okay. So why do we think natural resources are important? Well, one thing is this. So the good side is that, the good reason is that you have so the good reason is unique, right? So you have a better balance of payments position. So you can finance many needs of your country through that natural resource rent. Okay? So the important concept is here natural resource rents. Okay? And in fact, if you go to World Development Indicators, there is that indicator of share of natural resource rents in GDP. Okay? And in some countries, of course, that share is too large, such as, Kuwait or Saudi Arabia or other countries that are famous for being the biggest oil exporters, right? So that's the good reason. At least you have a financial resource. So you have a natural resource that you can convert to a financial resource in the global energy markets or global markets for natural resources. There are two bad reasons. Two disadvantages. One is called the Dutch disease. And the other is called rent-seeking, corruption, and other related phenomena. Now, let me first explain the Dutch disease. If you have a large amount of natural resources, this means, through the good reason, right? This means you have an easy way to earn money, right? As a nation, if you are technologically sophisticated enough to export it, at least, even in the raw form, okay, raw natural resource form, you earn money. So why is that a problem? Why is that a disease? Because it may hinder and or delay industrialization, right? Typically, what we expect along the economic development, if you remember, is that the share of agriculture decreases, right? So this is agriculture. The share of manufacturing increases, and then it can decrease. And services could be like that. Okay. So that is a typical thing that we would observe in today's highly developed economies. Now, if you have a large amount of natural resource rents, okay, this transition may not take place in terms of production of the merchandise products, right? Why? Because the efforts would be channeled through extracting natural resource rents. Okay, so resources could be allocated more on the extraction technologies. So how do we actually get this oil from underground to the pipeline, right? How do we get and contain the natural gas, which is originally located between different layers underground? How do we contain that? So the efforts and investments are concentrated more on the economy of this natural resource extraction. Okay, so that may hinder or delay, so that could be a disadvantage for manufacturing. And this is actually called the Dutch disease, because when a natural resource, I think it was natural gas, was found in Netherlands in I don't know, 70s or 80s. So that created a decrease in the pace of manufacturing increase in Netherlands, actually. So for that reason, it is called Dutch disease. But it is important. So in many countries, we observe late or lower manufacturing. Either the manufacturing has not increased at all, or it increased only later or in a slower pace, because the investments in the country are directed towards the natural resource sector. Okay. Now the other reason is that having a large endowment of natural resources actually create or contribute to the creation of bad institutions. Why is that? Well, because there is this public resource out there. So originally it is the entire states, right? So in a democracy, so that means this resource is owned by all citizens of this country, right? But in practice, it is of course exploited, and exploited by whom is the main question, right? So who is going to be benefiting from these natural resource rates? Okay, of course, in many of these countries, there are already poor institutions. There are already, most of them are former colonies. They're already subject to certain institutional problems, and discovering certain natural resources create that rent-seeking problem and corrupt political practices, so that certain groups in the society, certain groups with de facto power, could try to control the government and try to obtain these natural resource rents. Okay, so this again is related with, I mean, these two mechanisms are related because some of these elite people who are after the natural resource rents, of course, they invest in the natural resource sector. Okay, but the problem is that government officials may not be entirely honest and honored to protect the public welfare. All right, they might be bribed, so they might use their jurisdictional or executive powers to create favorable conditions for the elite groups they protect, and those elite groups pay their share, and only a few in a particular country can actually benefit from these natural resource rights. Otherwise, you may not be. I mean, in many countries, one particular example is Nigeria, actually. So in many countries that have large natural resources, large amounts of natural resources, we see poverty problems, right? How can it be possible? Well, it is possible because the institutional setup in the country is an endogenous outcome, given that natural resource endowments create such Dutch diseases and mechanisms such as rent seeking and corruption. Then, of course, resources are transferred only to certain groups that are closer to government or closer to the king, and so on and so forth. Okay, so these two disadvantages in general called natural resource curves. So instead of being a virtue, it may actually be a curse, because those things, delaying or hindering manufacturing and creating bad institutions, actually is a curse for the long run growth rate of the economy, because in corrupt economies where rent seeking is the principal motivation, you may not really observe technological innovations or large masses of people obtaining advanced education and so on and so forth, because poverty will prevail and the country will be under the illusion that natural resource will always be there and that will be always used for transfer spendings and other stuff to basically solve for the balance of payments problems. But of course, this is not the case, because most of these natural resources are actually fossil fuels. So at some point in the future, these countries will diminish these natural resources, and they're gonna end up with no industry, no innovation machine, and no resources at all. All right. So in the future, today's oil exporter countries, other than Norway and some other developed ones, they're gonna be facing much difficult development problems. Okay. All right. I think that's all I'm gonna say today. Let me stop sharing and pause here for your questions or comments. From Esra, there's a question in the chat window, but isn't it the lack of ability to use this resource efficiently that makes it bad? Well, yes, but there are reasons for this inefficiency, right? Because human agency and political constraints enter the picture, Esra. If everybody, suppose that the government is the perfect government in the sense that they are 100% benevolent, they always prioritize the public benefit without really considering any favorable groups, or without really allowing for any corrupt practices to invade the use of such natural resources. Then in that case, obviously, that would be at least more equitable, and I'm sure more efficient as well. The problem here is that in reality, it's not the case, right? So for instance, Turkey has this varlık fonu, right? The wealth fund. Let me give you an example of a country that has a wealth fund. Norway. Norway has a wealth fund, and they're actually in a surplus position right now, because they invest the entire oil money to their kids basically into this wealth fund. In Turkey, Turkey is not in a surplus position, right? Turkey's institutions that are consolidated under Turkish wealth fund are actually, I mean, many of them have large amount of debt. So so the ability to use it depends on your political motives and political constraints. If you do not have any such political disadvantages, then of course you may imagine that. I mean, even if you do not have the extraction technology, so even if you don't know initially how to extract crude oil from underground to the surface and transport it to the pipeline, you may still purchase that technology from other countries. But for that, you of course need you of course need to use that type of procurement technologies, ihale. So public procurement mechanisms should be transparent and so the responsible government or a fully benevolent government could of course use such systems more efficiently and effectively. But here we are talking about the resource curse as an externality to the entire economy, right? Because if there is a natural resource curse because of the Dutch disease and the corruption mechanism, then this is bad for the entire society and all the other sectors, right? Because if there is a corrupt government or corruption is seen as something typical or something tolerable, then of course other sectors can also be invaded by such predatory entrepreneurs. Okay, so and after a couple of generations, it all seems very normal, right? I mean, right now, if you are in sub-Saharan Africa, and if you were born there and raised within such a culture, it would be totally okay for you to be in conflict with the other ethnicity in the same country, because you were born into this. You would have been born into this culture. Your fathers and mothers would also have been born into this culture. Your grandparents and all. So how do you break that cycle? So of course this is the difficult problem, and corruption. I mean, institutions and culture are very, very resilient to change. They are very powerful. You may think that, okay, there will come a time because rational decision making by responsible human beings will make a difference, right? That never comes. That is only a so that happens, of course, but only very, very occasionally. Only when Goldilocks conditions, many different conditions are satisfied together, you see something like a French Revolution, or some conditions get together in a miraculous way, and you see the sexual revolution of 1960s. So things like that. Most of the time, rational human beings realize the problems, but they find it rational for themselves not to respond. So because we have short-sighted, we don't really care about others, including future generations. We are self-deceptive. We are suffering from Dunning-Kruger effect and many other behavioral biases. This is our nature. So we need coordination mechanisms. We need mechanisms that coordinate our expectations for the benefit of the common good, right? So as economics graduates, you quite easily understand the notion of the tragedy of commons, right? Look at the mask restrictions and mask wearing practices of Turkish people. So it is basically a tragedy of common sting, right? Because if I do not wear a mask when I'm sick, I'm creating a negative externality for my fellow citizens. And most people think, okay, I'm going out today, even if I don't have to, because some others are already staying at home. Well, that's not the case if everybody thinks likewise, as you know wholeheartedly. So institutions and culture change only very slowly, only sporadically when there is a revolution. Okay. All right. Any other questions or comments? Okay, then. So last week we completed our discussion of sources of growth, and today we start our discussion of the causes of growth. The first deep fundamental determinant of long-run growth in a country is geography, and here we discussed several mechanisms why geography, through the location and size of the countries, through the climate conditions, and through the availability of natural resources, can actually shape the culture and institutions and productivity, etc., and have long-run effects. So this is just the very, let me say, superficial understanding of a huge literature. So if you are interested in such things, look at the textbooks, make some Google searches, watch that Paul Romer video. And in the next lecture, 2 weeks ahead, after the holiday break, we're gonna look at institutions. Okay.
Teşekkür ederiz hocam.
Okay then. So have a nice day and take care of yourselves. Bye bye.
Görüşürüz.
Görüşürüz hocam. İyi bayramlar.
Size de iyi bayramlar.